Lars Eriksson found his trapping partner Henrik frozen to death on the morning of February 9, 1836, less than 6 feet from a fireplace that had burned through the entire night. The discovery would launch an obsession that every other trapper in the Montana Territory would call madness. Until the winter, they needed what Lars had built to survive. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you love stories of frontier innovation that saved lives, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story is even more remarkable than this one. The fire had never gone out. That was the part Lars couldn't reconcile as he knelt beside Henrik Torvald's body in the pre-dawn darkness of their cabin. The fireplace still held glowing coals. The stack of split wood beside the hearth remained untouched from the night before. Henrik had done everything right. He had built up the fire before sleeping. He had positioned his bedroll close to the stone hearth, close enough that Lars had warned him several times about sparks. He had wrapped himself in 2 heavy wool blankets and a bearskin. And still, sometime in the coldest hours before dawn, his body had simply stopped generating enough heat to survive. Lars had been gone for 3 days, checking their distant trap lines. He had returned expecting to find Henrik preparing breakfast and complaining about the cold, as he always did. Instead, he found his partner rigid beneath his blankets, frost crystallized in his beard, his face peaceful as though he had simply fallen asleep and chosen not to wake. The cabin's interior temperature, even with the fire still burning, felt barely warmer than the air outside. Lars's breath clouded visibly in the firelight. The water bucket near the door had frozen solid. Henrik was 31 years old, experienced in wilderness living, and careful about cold weather protocols. He had survived 6 winters in the mountains. This was not a case of carelessness or ignorance. This was the brutal reality of frontier heating methods failing against temperatures that had dropped to levels Lars had never experienced. He had seen cold nights before, but the cold that had killed Henrik was something different entirely, something that exposed how inadequate their standard cabin construction and heating actually were. Lars spent that morning performing the grim tasks required. He wrapped Henrik's body in the bearskin and canvas. He couldn't bury him. The ground was frozen solid 4 feet down. He would have to cache the body in a protected location until spring thaw allowed for proper burial. He worked mechanically, his mind already moving past grief into something more focused and urgent. Henrik's death was not just a personal tragedy. It was evidence of a fundamental problem that killed trappers and settlers with brutal regularity every winter. By midday, Lars had secured Henrik's body in a small cave formation half a mile from the cabin, protected from scavengers by heavy rocks. He returned to the cabin and stood in the doorway, studying the space with different eyes. The fireplace dominated one wall, built from river stones and mud mortar in the style every mountain man knew. It drew air efficiently. It produced adequate flame. It consumed wood at a steady rate, and it had utterly failed to keep a healthy man alive through a single night. Lars walked to the fireplace and placed his hand on the stones. They were warm, retaining heat from the morning's coals. But that warmth radiated in only one direction, away from the wall. The chimney above drew most of the heat upward and out of the structure. He estimated that for every piece of wood he burned, perhaps 1/4 of its heat actually stayed in the living space. The rest escaped through the chimney, through gaps in the log walls, through the roof. Henrik had frozen to death, not because there wasn't enough fire, but because the fire's heat wasn't staying where it needed to be. Lars spent the next week alone in the cabin, trapped by continuous snowfall that made travel impossible. He kept the fireplace burning constantly, feeding it wood every few hours, and began documenting what he observed. He was not an educated man in the formal sense. He had learned to read and write from his mother in Norway before his family immigrated when he was 14. But he understood practical observation, and what he observed during those isolated days fundamentally changed how he thought about survival. The fireplace consumed an enormous amount of wood. He calculated that maintaining livable temperature required approximately 1 full cord every 10 days. That meant cutting, hauling, splitting, and stacking over 3 cords per month during deep winter. The labor alone was substantial, but more troubling was the inefficiency he witnessed. He held his hand at various distances from the fire and felt how rapidly the heat diminished. 3 feet from the flames, the warmth was noticeable. 6 feet away, it was barely perceptible. 10 feet away, near his sleeping area, the temperature felt only marginally warmer than outside. He began a simple experiment. He placed a tin cup of water at different locations around the cabin while maintaining a strong fire. The cup positioned 2 feet from the fireplace remained liquid. The cup placed near the door froze within an hour. The cup positioned in the sleeping area developed ice crystals within 3 hours. The fireplace was creating a small zone of warmth immediately around itself, but failing to heat the entire space. Lars started visiting other trappers' cabins within traveling distance as weather permitted. He told them he was checking on their welfare after the brutal cold, which was true, but his real purpose was studying their heating methods. Every cabin he visited used the same basic design: stone or mud fireplace built against one wall, chimney drawing smoke and heat upward, wood consumed at prodigious rates, and every trapper he spoke with complained about the same problem. They could keep warm near the fire, but the rest of the cabin remained dangerously cold during severe weather. One trapper named Bjorn Halverson had lost 3 fingers to frostbite the previous winter, despite never leaving his cabin during a week-long cold spell. He had simply reached for something stored against the far wall and discovered his fingers had frozen while he worked. Another family Lars knew had abandoned their claim entirely after their youngest child developed severe respiratory problems from the constant cold. The pattern was clear and consistent. Standard fireplace heating kept you alive if you stayed within a few feet of the flames, but offered little protection beyond that narrow radius. Lars became obsessed with a single question: where did the heat go? He knew it was produced by burning wood. He could feel it radiating from the flames, but somehow most of that heat never translated into sustained warmth throughout the living space. He lay awake at night thinking about smoke rising up chimneys, about cold air seeping through log gaps, about the fundamental mismatch between heat production and heat retention. Henrik had died because their cabin couldn't hold warmth. Understanding why that happened was the first step toward preventing it from happening again. The idea came to Lars during a supply trip to the trading post in late March. He had gone to purchase basic provisions and sell the furs he and Henrik had accumulated before Henrik's death. While waiting for the trader to tally his accounts, Lars wandered through the post's main room and noticed the massive stone hearth that dominated the center of the space. Unlike cabin fireplaces built against walls, this hearth stood free in the middle of the room, with the chimney rising straight up through the roof. What caught Lars's attention was how the stones radiated heat hours after the fire had been reduced to coals. He placed his palm against the rock surface and felt sustained warmth that had nothing to do with active flames. The stones had absorbed heat during the day and were releasing it slowly into the surrounding space. The principle was simple but profound. Stone held heat. Wood did not. If you could surround fire with enough stone mass, that mass would store thermal energy and release it gradually over time. Lars returned to his cabin with an idea forming that seemed almost absurdly simple. What if instead of building a fire that sent most of its heat up a chimney, you built a fire surrounded by material that would capture and hold that heat? The challenge was finding enough stone and transporting it to his remote location. River rocks were available, but gathering and hauling the quantity he envisioned would take months. Then he remembered something his father had done when building their family's root cellar in Norway, making bricks from clay. The process was labor-intensive but required only materials available near his cabin. Lars found a clay deposit along the creek bank half a mile downstream. The clay was dense and plastic, ideal for brickmaking. He dug out approximately 200 pounds and hauled it back in canvas sacks over multiple trips. Near the cabin, he built a simple rectangular mold from scrap wood, creating a form roughly 8 inches long, 4 inches wide, and 3 inches deep. He mixed the clay with water until it reached a thick, workable consistency, then added sand from the creek bed to prevent excessive cracking during drying. Some brickmakers used straw, but Lars wanted maximum density for heat retention, so he kept his mixture simple, 3 parts clay to 1 part sand with just enough water to make it moldable. He pressed the mixture into his wooden mold, smoothed the top surface, then carefully removed the form, leaving a wet brick to dry. The work was monotonous and slow. He could produce roughly 8 bricks per day, laying them out on flat ground to dry in the spring sun. Each brick required 4 to 5 days of drying before it was firm enough to handle. He needed the bricks to cure slowly to prevent cracking. While they dried, he made more, establishing a production cycle that consumed his daylight hours. Bjorn Halvorsen visited in early April and found Lars surrounded by rows of drying clay bricks. "You building a fortress?" Bjorn asked, genuinely puzzled. Lars didn't explain his actual plan. He simply said he was experimenting with construction materials. Bjorn left shaking his head, convinced Lars had gone slightly mad from isolation and grief. By late April, Lars had accumulated over 200 dried bricks stacked carefully inside his cabin. They represented 6 weeks of continuous work, and he still wasn't certain he had enough for what he was planning. But spring weather was arriving, and he needed to begin the actual construction while ground conditions allowed for digging. What he intended to build would require excavation beneath his cabin floor, a project that would confirm every neighbor's suspicion that Henrik's death had broken something fundamental in Lars's mind. The concept was counterintuitive to everything frontier construction wisdom taught. Fireplaces were built upward and against walls because heat rose, and chimneys needed to draw smoke away from living spaces. Lars intended to do the opposite. He would dig downward into the earth beneath his cabin and create a fire chamber below floor level, lined with brick, that would absorb and radiate heat upward through the floorboards. The design violated every principle other trappers understood about heating, but Lars had spent months thinking through the physics, and he believed it would work. He began by carefully removing a section of floorboards near the center of his cabin. The planks were heavy and well fitted, requiring pry bars and patience to extract without splitting them. He created a rectangular opening, approximately 3 feet wide and 4 feet long, exposing the packed earth beneath. Then he started digging. The soil was still partially frozen at depth, making the work brutally difficult. He used a combination of picks, shovels, and pry bars to break through the harder layers. His plan called for a pit 18 inches deep, shallow enough that he wouldn't hit groundwater or create structural instability, but deep enough to contain fire safely and provide adequate brick mass around the flames. He excavated carefully, keeping the walls as vertical as possible and the floor level. The removed dirt he hauled outside in canvas sacks, creating a growing pile behind his cabin that served as visible evidence of his project. Bjorn Halvorsen returned in early May, drawn by curiosity about what Lars was doing. When he saw the hole in the cabin floor, his confusion turned to open concern. "You're digging up your cabin floor? To build what, exactly?" Lars explained that he was creating an underground heating system that would use thermal mass to retain warmth. Bjorn stared at the excavation, then at Lars, then back at the hole. "You're building a fire pit inside your cabin? In the floor?" His tone carried disbelief that bordered on alarm. Lars tried to explain the principle of heat retention versus heat production, about how brick mass would store thermal energy, about how radiant heat from below would be more efficient than convection heat from a wall fireplace. Bjorn listened with growing skepticism. "Lars, fire goes in a fireplace, with a chimney. You're going to burn down your cabin or suffocate from smoke." He left convinced that grief had made Lars dangerous to himself. Word spread quickly through the scattered trapping community. Thomas Whitmore heard about the excavation from Bjorn and mentioned it to every trapper who came through the trading post. The story evolved with each telling. Lars was building something that would kill him before winter returned. Lars began laying bricks in mid-May once the excavation was complete. He had prepared a mortar using clay mixed with sand and water, creating a paste that would bond the bricks and seal gaps between them. The process required precision he had never attempted before. Each brick needed to be positioned level and plumb, with consistent mortar joints that would cure into a solid mass. He started with the floor of the pit, laying a single course of bricks across the earth bottom to create a fireproof base that would prevent heat from dissipating directly into the ground. The walls required more careful work. He built them up course by course, spreading mortar on the previous layer, positioning each brick, checking for level, then tapping it into place. The corners were particularly challenging, requiring him to alternate brick orientation to create interlocking joints that would distribute structural stress. He worked slowly, completing perhaps 3 or 4 courses per day. The mortar needed time to set between layers, and rushing would compromise the entire structure. As the walls rose, Lars incorporated a design feature he had spent weeks considering. Rather than building straight vertical walls, he angled the upper courses slightly outward, creating a gentle taper that would reflect heat upward toward the floor opening. The angle was subtle, perhaps 5 degrees from vertical, but it meant each course required slightly different positioning. The mathematics were intuitive rather than calculated, adjusted by eye and feel as he worked. By early June, the pit walls stood complete at 6 courses high, bringing them nearly flush with the underside of his cabin floor. Lars had deliberately left narrow gaps at 2 opposite corners where the brick walls met the earth. These gaps, each roughly 2 inches wide, would serve as air intakes, drawing fresh oxygen into the pit from below floor level while allowing combustion gases to escape upward through the main opening. The design eliminated the need for a traditional chimney while ensuring the fire would burn efficiently. Thomas Whitmore made a special trip from the trading post specifically to see what Lars had built. He arrived with 2 other trappers, all curious about the project that had become legendary for its apparent foolishness. They stood in Lars's cabin, staring down at the brick-lined pit, trying to understand what they were looking at. "You're going to burn wood in that hole?" Thomas asked. Lars confirmed that was exactly his intention. "And the smoke goes where?" Lars explained his air gap system and how heat would radiate through the floor rather than escape up a chimney. Thomas shook his head slowly. "Lars, I respect that you've worked hard on this, but you've built something that makes no sense. Fire needs a chimney. Everyone knows that. You're going to fill your cabin with smoke, or you're going to burn through your floorboards, or both." The other trappers murmured agreement. One suggested gently that perhaps Lars should consider returning to civilization for a season, implying that isolation had affected his judgment. After they left, Lars stood alone looking at his creation. He had invested 4 months of labor into something every experienced frontiersman believed was fundamentally flawed. But he had also calculated every element based on principles of heat transfer and thermal mass that he trusted more than conventional wisdom. Lars replaced the floorboards around the pit opening in late June, cutting them carefully to create a precise rectangular frame. He left the center section removable, designing a cover made from multiple planks joined with cross braces that could be lifted out when he needed to tend the fire and replaced to protect the opening when the system wasn't in use. The fit was tight enough that minimal heat would escape around the edges, but not so tight that expansion from temperature changes would cause binding. On June 23, 1836, Lars built the first fire in his underground heating system. He started small, placing kindling on the brick floor of the pit and lighting it with charcloth and flint. The kindling caught quickly, and he watched carefully to see where the smoke would go. It rose through the opening as expected, but then seemed to hang in the cabin rather than venting efficiently. He had anticipated this problem. Without active draw from a chimney, the smoke needed time to find its path through the air gaps and out through the spaces between his roof logs. He added small pieces of split wood once the kindling established a coal bed. The fire grew gradually, and Lars noted that the smoke began clearing as the system warmed. The rising heat created natural convection that pulled fresh air through the bottom gaps and pushed combustion gases upward and outward. Within 20 minutes, the cabin air was nearly clear, despite the fire burning steadily below his feet. The principle worked, though not as quickly as a traditional chimney would have cleared smoke. Bjorn Halvorsen had promised to check on Lars that afternoon, partly from genuine concern and partly to witness what he expected would be a disaster. He arrived to find Lars calmly sitting at his table with a fire burning in the floor pit. Bjorn's expression moved from surprise to confusion. "It's not smoking?" Lars gestured around the cabin. The air was clear except for a faint haze near the ceiling. "Takes a few minutes to establish draw, but then it vents naturally." Bjorn examined the setup, clearly struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he expected. "But does it actually heat anything?" Bjorn asked, the skepticism still heavy in his voice. Lars admitted that was the real test. The fire had only been burning for an hour. The bricks needed time to absorb heat before they would begin radiating it effectively. Bjorn placed his hand near the floor around the pit opening and felt mild warmth, nothing impressive. He stood and shook his head. "Lars, you spent 4 months building a fire pit that produces less heat than a regular fireplace. I hope you're planning to build an actual hearth before winter." After Bjorn left, Lars continued monitoring his system. As afternoon moved toward evening, he noticed the floorboards around the pit were becoming noticeably warm to the touch, not hot enough to char or damage, but distinctly warmer than ambient temperature. The bricks were absorbing thermal energy and beginning to release it. He added more wood, maintaining a moderate fire rather than building large flames. The goal wasn't maximum immediate heat, but sustained absorption into the brick mass. Over the next 3 months, Lars refined his understanding of how the buried heat pit actually functioned. The learning process involved constant adjustment and observation, documenting what worked and what didn't. He discovered that the system operated on principles fundamentally different from fireplace heating, requiring different fuel management and completely different expectations about heat delivery timing. Traditional fireplaces provided immediate warmth. You built a fire and felt heat within minutes. Lars's underground system worked on delayed release. He would build a moderate fire in the morning, feeding it steadily for 3 to 4 hours until the brick mass reached saturation temperature. Then he would let the fire die down to coals or go out entirely. The bricks would continue radiating heat for 8 to 10 hours afterward, releasing the thermal energy they had absorbed slowly and consistently. The efficiency was remarkable once he understood the timing. A fireplace required constant feeding to maintain warmth, consuming wood continuously as most heat escaped up the chimney. Lars's system required one sustained burn period that heated the brick mass, followed by hours of passive heat release that required no additional fuel. He calculated he was using approximately 60% less wood than his previous fireplace had consumed for comparable heating effect. The heat distribution was also superior. Fireplace heat concentrated in a narrow zone immediately around the hearth. The floor-based system radiated warmth upward through the entire floor surface. Standing anywhere in the cabin, Lars felt heat rising from below. The sensation was different from fireplace warmth, less intense but more encompassing. His feet were warm, which he had never experienced with wall-mounted heating. The warmth seemed to fill the space more evenly. He experimented with fuel types and discovered that hardwood worked significantly better than softwood. Oak and hickory burned slower and hotter, transferring more energy into the brick mass. Pine burned fast and produced less sustained heat. He also learned that the fire's position within the pit mattered. Centered fires heated the brick mass more evenly than fires built against one side. The air gap system required adjustment. His initial 2-inch openings drew too much air during windy conditions, causing the fire to burn too quickly. He packed one gap partially with clay, reducing airflow to a level that maintained steady combustion without waste. The reduced opening also improved heat retention, forcing more thermal energy into the bricks rather than up and out. By September, Lars had developed a routine that felt natural. Morning fire built and maintained until midday. Afternoon warmth from radiating bricks, evening adding coals if needed for overnight heat retention. The system worked so smoothly that he stopped thinking about it as experimental and began relying on it as his primary heating method. Thomas Whitmore visited the trading post in early October and asked Bjorn if Lars had built a proper fireplace yet. Bjorn admitted he hadn't checked recently, but assumed Lars must have, since only a fool would try to winter with that floor pit design. Neither man knew that Lars had no intention of building anything else. He had spent the summer proving to himself that his impossible heating system actually worked better than any fireplace he had ever used. The winter of 1836 arrived early and brutal. Snow began falling in mid-October, unusual for the region, and temperatures dropped steadily through November. By early December, the scattered trapping community was experiencing cold that exceeded anything in living memory. Trappers who had survived a decade in the mountains talked about the winter with genuine fear, comparing it to stories their grandfathers told about the legendary cold years that killed livestock and people with equal efficiency. Lars monitored the conditions carefully from his cabin. He had laid in substantial firewood during autumn, stacking split hardwood along the interior walls and under tarps outside. His heat pit system was performing exactly as he had hoped. Each morning he built a fire that burned for 3 to 4 hours, heating the brick mass to saturation. The floor remained warm throughout the day and into the evening, radiating stored heat that kept the cabin interior comfortable even as outside temperatures plummeted. On December 18th, the temperature dropped to a level that would later be estimated at 40 degrees below zero, though few trappers owned thermometers and exact measurements were impossible. What was certain was that exposed skin froze within minutes, and breathing the outside air felt like inhaling knives. Lars's cabin maintained an interior temperature he estimated around 45 to 50 degrees with a single morning fire. The brick mass held enough thermal energy that even 12 hours after the flames died, the floor remained noticeably warm. Other cabins were not faring as well. Bjorn Halvorsen was burning wood continuously, feeding his fireplace every 2 hours day and night, and still watching frost form on the interior walls farthest from the hearth. Thomas Whitmore at the trading post kept 3 fires burning simultaneously and had moved his family's sleeping area to within 6 feet of the largest hearth. Families with children were particularly desperate, trying to keep the youngest warm enough to avoid the respiratory illnesses that killed infants during severe cold. The cold snap continued for 5 days without relief. On the 3rd day, a trapper named Niels Andersen made the difficult journey from his cabin to check on neighbors, following a protocol the community had established for extreme weather. He visited Bjorn first and found him exhausted from maintaining constant fires, his wood supply depleting at an unsustainable rate. Bjorn mentioned that he should check on Lars, though he doubted Lars had survived with only that foolish floor pit for heat. Niels arrived at Lars's cabin, expecting to find either a man burning through wood desperately or a frozen corpse. Instead, he found Lars working on repairing a snowshoe, sitting comfortably in his cabin, wearing a single wool shirt. The interior felt warmer than Bjorn's cabin had despite no visible fire burning. Niels stared around in confusion. "Where's your fire?" Lars gestured at the floor opening. "Burned out 4 hours ago. Floor's still releasing heat." Niels knelt and placed his hand on the floorboards near the pit. The wood was distinctly warm, almost hot to sustained touch. "How was this possible?" Niels asked. Lars explained the thermal mass principle, how the bricks absorbed heat during the morning burn and released it gradually throughout the day and night. Niels listened with growing comprehension and growing alarm. "Bjorn's burning through his winter wood supply, keeping his fireplace going constantly. You're telling me you only fire this once a day?" Niels left Lars's cabin and returned immediately to Bjorn's location. He found Bjorn struggling to split frozen wood in near darkness, desperate to maintain his fire through another night. Niels told him what he had witnessed at Lars's cabin, describing the warmth, the efficiency, the fact that Lars had burned no wood for hours yet remained comfortable. Bjorn's initial reaction was disbelief. "That's impossible. You can't heat a cabin with a fire that's been out for 4 hours." But Niels insisted on what he had felt with his own hands. The cold snap broke temporarily on December 23rd, allowing for safer travel. Bjorn made the journey to Lars's cabin, bringing Thomas Whitmore with him. Both men were exhausted from maintaining constant fires and skeptical of Niels's report. They arrived to find Lars's cabin noticeably warmer than the outside air despite no smoke coming from any opening. Lars invited them inside, and they immediately felt the temperature difference. Thomas pulled off his heavy coat within minutes, something he hadn't done in his own cabin for weeks. Lars showed them his system, explaining how the morning fire heated the brick mass and how that mass released warmth for extended periods. He demonstrated by placing their hands on the floor near the pit opening. The floorboards were warm enough that sustained contact became uncomfortable. Bjorn examined the brick-lined chamber, studying the construction he had mocked 6 months earlier. "How much warmer is it in here compared to outside?" he asked. Lars estimated the difference at roughly 40 degrees when the system was fully charged. Outside temperatures were hovering near zero. His cabin interior felt close to 40 degrees. Thomas did his own calculation. "I'm keeping 3 fires burning, and my cabin barely stays above freezing. You're maintaining 40 degrees with 1 fire per day?" Lars confirmed this was accurate. The wood consumption difference was equally dramatic. Thomas estimated he was burning a cord of wood every 4 days during the severe cold. Lars was using approximately 1 cord every 3 weeks. The efficiency gap was almost incomprehensible to men accustomed to fireplace heating. Word spread rapidly after Thomas returned to the trading post. Within a week, trappers were making difficult winter journeys specifically to see Lars's heating system. Some came skeptical and left convinced. Others came desperate for solutions to their own heating failures. A family named the Richardsons had nearly lost their youngest child to cold-related illness and begged Lars to help them build a similar system. Lars agreed and spent 2 weeks in January helping them excavate and construct a heat pit in their cabin floor. By February, 3 other families had begun similar projects, working through winter conditions to create underground heating systems based on Lars's design. The construction was difficult in frozen ground, but the alternative was continuing to burn unsustainable amounts of wood for inadequate warmth. Bjorn Halvorsen started his own heat pit in March, admitting openly that he had been wrong about Lars's design. "I called you crazy," Bjorn said while Lars helped him lay bricks. "Turns out you were the only one thinking clearly." Lars didn't respond to the apology. He simply continued teaching Bjorn the technique, sharing freely what had taken him months to develop. The winter of 1836 became known throughout the northern Rocky Mountain Territory as the Year of Killing Cold. Exact mortality figures were never recorded, but oral histories from the period reference multiple deaths from exposure and cold-related illness among both indigenous populations and settler communities. Those who survived did so through a combination of preparation, luck, and in some cases, access to heating methods that exceeded standard fireplace efficiency. Lars Eriksson's buried heat pit design spread organically through the trapping and early settler community over the following decade. He never promoted the system or claimed credit for its development. When people asked for help building their own versions, he provided guidance freely, teaching the principles of thermal mass, proper brickmaking, and pit construction. Some implementations followed his design closely. Others adapted the concept to available materials and specific needs. A few trappers used stone instead of brick. Some built larger pits. Others incorporated dual air gap systems or experimented with different floor coverings. By 1840, an estimated 24 cabins in the Montana and Wyoming territories used underground heating systems derived from Lars's original design. The technique acquired various names. Some called them floor furnaces. Others referred to them as thermal pits or ground hearths. A few people called them Eriksson stoves, though Lars never used that term himself. What mattered was that families who implemented the design reported dramatic improvements in heating efficiency and wood consumption. The typical implementation used 60 to 70% less fuel than standard fireplaces while maintaining superior interior temperatures. The thermal mass principle that Lars had discovered through necessity and grief eventually found its way into more formal frontier architecture. Trading posts began incorporating similar systems in their main buildings. Some military outposts experimented with underground heating for barracks. The technique was particularly valued in locations where wood supply was limited or where extreme cold made constant fire maintenance dangerous. Lars himself continued trapping until 1842, when declining beaver populations and changing markets made the profession unsustainable. He sold his mountain cabin to a family moving west and relocated to the Oregon Territory, where he established a small farm near the Willamette Valley. He married in 1844 a widow named Sarah Brennan, who had lost her husband during the overland journey. They had 2 children and lived quietly, farming and occasionally taking in travelers who needed shelter during difficult seasons. Lars died in 1869 at age 63 from pneumonia that developed after working in cold rain during spring planting. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Salem, his grave marked with a simple wooden cross that listed his name and dates. The inscription made no mention of his time in the mountains or the heating system he had developed. To his family and neighbors, he was simply a Norwegian immigrant who had worked hard and lived honestly. But in the mountains of Montana and Wyoming, cabins with brick-lined pits beneath their floors continued providing efficient heat for decades after Lars's death. Some remained in use into the early 1900s, long after their original builders had died or moved on. They stood as silent testament to a simple truth, that innovation born from tragedy and refined through patient observation could solve problems that tradition considered unsolvable. Lars Eriksson had built something impossible that became routine, proving that sometimes the best solutions required thinking beneath rather than beyond conventional wisdom.